Hi everyone, this is Caleb and this is your video for Luke chapter 22. I'm coming to you from the balcony at Father Dyer Church. You can see the peaks behind me. You can probably also hear some traffic. The lighting may not be so hot, but don't look at this, just look at the amazing mountains and the sunset behind me. So here in Luke chapter 22, we are in the heart of Holy Week. We read about Jesus and the disciples celebrating Passover, the first communion, and also Jesus being arrested. So since chapter 19 and during Holy Week, Jesus has been on this path that he knows this confrontation with the religious authorities is coming. In verses 1 through 6, we see that confrontation really gain traction, where the priests and the scribes who are in charge of the temple, so this is the temple group coming after Jesus, not the Pharisees, but the temple group coming after Jesus, because he's talked to them as well and called them out. And so they're now like, we got to get rid of Jesus, not just the Pharisees, but this other group too. And then Judas, the betrayer, one of Jesus's own, joins the conspiracy. And it's always good to remember that Judas has been with Jesus for like 3 years. All the miracles, all the teachings, Judas has been there for all of it. And that just adds some weight to the betrayal. That Judas isn't just some guy who just shows up out of nowhere. He's been with Jesus and the other disciples for 3 years. Now, there's a reason this happens at Passover. There's a reason in God's plan this happens at Passover. But it's interesting to think about why the scribes and the chief priests would want this to happen or allow this to happen at Passover. Like they couldn't have waited a week, a month, I don't know. But again, there's God's timing in all this, that it happens at Passover. Now in verse 7 through 23, we read about that last Passover meal, or the first communion, the Lord's Supper, that Jesus has with his disciples. And it's interesting, a couple things to note. In verse 8, it says that Peter and John go to get the room ready. Doesn't mention James. Usually when Peter and John are doing something, James is there. They're kind of the inner circle of the disciples. So it's interesting of like, why isn't James involved in this? What is James doing at the time? And then they have the first communion, or their last Passover as a group, there in that upper room. And always pay attention, because this is where our understanding and our theology and our practice around communion comes from. And one of the biggest things we draw from the text is that Judas, the betrayer, takes communion. Jesus doesn't say, all right, 11 of you are going to do this, except for Judas, you need to step out. No, Judas is there the whole time. And Jesus even acknowledges the one who's going to betray me is at the table. And guess what? He still gets communion. And that's the biggest reason we practice communion the way we do in the Methodist Church, where all are welcome and we don't have any requirements at all. Just be a human and have a pulse. And we can probably even maybe fudge that. If Judas can take communion, everybody can take communion. So when you're reading it, pay attention to what Judas and Jesus are doing there at the table. In verses 24 through 30, the disciples, of course, get into an argument because they're human and they're at a dinner table and it's Passover and they might be a little stressed because it's been a big week. And this argument is exactly the same as they had in chapter 9, verses 46 through 48, where they're like, who's the greatest? Like, come on, let's rank ourselves. Or Jesus, maybe you want to rank us. And Peter, James, and John were probably like, we're at the top. We were there at the transfiguration. And then Peter and John were like, we got the room ready. He sends us to make the resis. And Jesus is like, are you for real? All this time, you still haven't learned? Here I am, Jesus, and I'm the greatest. And what am I doing? I'm serving you at this table. I just gave you communion. And you're going to argue about who's the greatest. Guess what? We still do this. We still argue about who's the greatest. And Jesus is just like, oh, this argument again? Like, let it go. None of this is about you. Just let it go. None of this is about your ego. The greatest among you will be the last. Those who serve are the ones who are the greatest. That's what Jesus is trying to get across. He's been trying to do that to us for 2,000 years. Okay. So then they have the argument. And then in verses 31 through 35, Jesus particularly talks to Peter. And he particularly tells Peter, here's what's going to happen. very shortly, you are going to deny me. And of course, Peter's like, no, I'm not. I'll die with you. And Jesus is like, yeah, no. So that's going to happen and you're going to run. And of course, that happens here in a bit. And Jesus gives him that dramatic, when the cock crows 3 times, when that rooster goes cock-a-doodle-doo thrice, you will have denied me 3 times. And then Jesus, in verses 35 through 38, gives them some practical advice, because Jesus knows, listen, the next 72 hours before you see me again are going to be rough. So he's like, get prepared, like, get your stuff together. The sword thing is interesting, because just in a little bit, Jesus is going to tell them to put away the swords, that like, no more of that. But here they're like, we got 2 swords, and he's like, that's enough. It's interesting if Jesus is like, oh yeah, whatever, I guess that's what you got, or if Jesus is really like, no, that's enough, you'll need those. Because just here in a little bit, Jesus is going to say, no, put away your swords, no more of that. So the sword thing here is interesting. The other things make a little sense, like have some footgear, have some money, because, you know, things are going to get weird and dramatic. But the sword thing, who knows? Because Jesus is going to tell them not to do that here in a bit. And then in verses 39 through 46, they go to pray at the Mount of Olives. And remember, this is what they've been doing every day in Holy Week. They're in Jerusalem during the day. At night, they go out to the Mount of Olives. So this just fits their regular pattern of what they've been doing all during Holy Week. So it's night. Their day is over in Jerusalem. They go to the Mount of Olives to pray. And the prayer that Jesus has in 42, I think, is the most powerful prayer in the Bible. It's also the best, like, concise example we see of Jesus's divinity, where he says, your will be done, and his humanity, where he's like, I don't want to do this. What an honest prayer. I don't want to do this, but your will be done. The most powerful prayer in the Bible, where there's honesty and then an acknowledgement that God's will, God's ways, God's wisdom is really ultimately what's most important. A great model for us. Be honest, but acknowledge that God's in control and that God's ways are the best ways. So then after Jesus prays, he gets arrested in verses 47 through 53. And the crowd here is made up of religious authorities and like their enforcers. It specifically says temple police. Imagine that, a religious institution, a temple, a church, a whatever, having like their own law enforcement, their own like armed or semi-armed folks to enforce things. But apparently that's the case, because it says there's temple police that come to get them. And so they go and get them. And Jesus is like, here I am. I've been here all week. And now you come and get me after Passover's done. So he's like, whatever, here I am. This is your time. The hour of darkness is here, and way to be a part of it. So Jesus calls them out and says, I've been here all week and you did nothing, but now you're doing things. And then comes this very dramatic scene in verses 54 through 62 where Peter denies Jesus. And pay attention to what the people say in here, because there's nothing here in the text that says, oh, you were with Jesus, let's arrest him too. Hey, this guy was with Jesus, let's beat him up. Hey, this guy's a Galilean, we can tell from his accent or his dress or his footwear or something. Hey, let's get him too. There's none of that. They just acknowledge, be like, oh, hey, you were with that guy that just got arrested. They don't charge him with anything. They don't threaten him with anything. But Peter still bails. And Peter still denies Jesus. And that just, I think, speaks to like the drama and the anxiety that Peter and every one of the disciples were feeling that night. So just pay attention to what the people actually say when they're interacting with Peter. And then there's just like this dramatic moment where it says Jesus looks at him. And apparently they're close enough to where that could happen, like physically at this time. And just imagine that, like, talk about an Oscar-winning scene. Like Jesus just like turns and looks at Peter. And can you imagine how Peter felt in that moment? Just the drama of this story is just so intense. All right, and then in verses 63 through the end of the chapter, Jesus he's there, he's arrested, they start beating him up. And then the next day, so night has transpired, Jesus is in custody, maybe he's getting beat up the whole night, maybe. I mean, not like this thing was pleasant. And then he goes before the council, the religious council, the chief priest and the scribe and the assemblies of elders. So the religious leaders assemble as they could do. They did this on a regular basis, not just for, messiahs. And they, level the charge. Be like, if you're the Messiah, if you're the chosen one, if you're the Christ, tell us right now. And Jesus is like, nope, not playing your games. Not, I'm barely going to say anything. And then they ask him, are you the Son of God? And his response is, well, you say I am. And they're like, all right, obviously he's not going to say what we want him to say, but that's enough. And then that closes the chapter. In chapter 23, we see the trial continue, where he goes from the religious authorities to the complex political situation in Judea at that time. Thanks for watching. This is some intense stuff. Read it slowly, read it a couple times, take it in, let it speak to you. Don't rush through it. Again, any questions or anything, email me, Calob@fatherdyer.com. Always love to hear questions about the Bible. No answers guaranteed, but always love to hear your questions. All right, check in on the next video when we look at Luke 23. Thanks for watching. Peace.